My name is Evelyn. I grew up in a house where love was a finite resource, and my sister, Clara, always seemed to hold the larger share. She was the light, the fragile flower, while I was the dirt she grew in, sturdy, unremarkable, and expected to endure. When Clara's kidneys began to fail, I didn't hesitate. I didn't ask for praise. I simply stepped into the cold white light of the operating room and gave her one of mine. I thought that by giving her life, I would finally earn a place in our parents' hearts. I was wrong. Instead of gratitude, I was met with a twisted narrative. They claimed I forced the donation to hold it over her head, that I played the martyr for attention, and that I made Clara feel indebted just to satisfy my ego. They didn't just take my organ, they took my dignity and then erased me from the family photo. 10 years have passed. I am no longer the girl seeking approval. I am Dr. Evelyn Thorne, the leading cardiothoracic surgeon in the country, and today, a man with a failing heart was wheeled into my surgical theater. A man named Silas, my father. The hospital corridor always felt like a tunnel between worlds, but on the day of the transplant, 10 years ago, it felt like a walk toward my own execution. I remember the smell of antiseptic, sharp, cold, and final. I remember the way my mother, Margaret, held Clara's hand, whispering prayers that sounded like jagged glass. She didn't look at me once, not even when the nurses came to prep me. "Are you sure about this, Evelyn?" the surgeon had asked, his voice softened by a pity I didn't want. "It's a major surgery. You're young." "She's my sister," I said. It was the only reason I needed. It was the only bridge I had left to a family that seemed to be drifting further away every year Clara spent in the hospital. The surgery was a success. Clara woke up with pink cheeks and a new lease on life. I woke up with a searing pain in my side and an emptiness that had nothing to do with the missing kidney. I waited for them to come to my room. I waited for Silas to pat my hand and say he was proud. I waited for Margaret to tell me I was a hero. They didn't come for 3 days. When they finally walked in, they didn't bring flowers, they brought resentment. Clara was already sitting in a wheelchair, looking vibrant, while I struggled to even sit up. "You really couldn't help yourself, could you?" Margaret said, her voice trembling not with relief, but with a cold, simmering anger. I blinked, confused by the morphine and the shock. What do you mean, Mom?" Silas added, standing by the window, refusing to look at me. "The nurses told us how you insisted on being the donor, how you made sure everyone knew you were the only match. You've made Clara feel a burden before she's even healed. You've turned her recovery into the Evelyn show." "I saved her life," I gasped, the stitches in my side feeling like they were tearing open. "You bought her life," Clara whispered, her voice laced with a newfound spite. "You gave it to me just so you could spend the next 40 years reminding me that I owe you. You didn't do this for me, Evelyn. You did it for the attention. You did it to be the perfect daughter while I'm the sick one. Well, I don't want your pity, and I don't want your kidney." "Then give it back," I wanted to scream, but the pain was too much. A week later, I was discharged. I went back to an empty apartment. My calls went to voicemail. My sister's social media was filled with photos of her miraculous recovery, thanking God and our parents, but never mentioning the donor. A month later, I received a letter in the mail. It wasn't a thank you note. It was a formal disinheritance. Silas had rewritten his will, claiming that my manipulative behavior and emotional blackmail made me unfit to be part of the family legacy. They excommunicated me from the family I had literally bled for. I sat in my small, dark kitchen and made a choice. I would not be the martyr they accused me of being. I would be something much more dangerous. I would be excellent. I used the small amount of money I had saved to move across the country. I buried myself in medical school. While Clara was out at parties celebrating the life I gave her, I was in the anatomy lab, memorizing the pathways of the human heart. While Silas and Margaret were bragging about their strong, resilient family, I was working 30-hour shifts in the trauma ward, learning how to stitch a life back together when it was falling apart in my hands. I became Evelyn Thorne, the woman with steady hands, the woman who didn't blink when an artery burst, the woman who lived in the silence of the operating room because the world outside was too full of noise and lies. 10 years of silence from them. I saw Clara's wedding photos in a magazine. She had married into a wealthy family, looking radiant. I wasn't in the background. I wasn't even in the credits. I saw Silas's name in the business journals as his firm grew. They were doing perfectly fine without the attention-seeking daughter. Until yesterday. The call came from the chief of surgery. "Evelyn, we have a high-profile transfer from the city, a Mr. Silas Thorne, severe aortic dissection. He's had 2 failed interventions already. You're the only one in the region with the success rate for this kind of repair. We need you in the OR at 0600. I looked at the chart on my tablet. I saw the name. I saw the medical history, a history that mentioned a family history of renal failure, a history that mentioned a daughter who had donated a kidney. The chart noted, donor daughter estranged. I stood in the scrub room this morning, the water running over my hands. I looked at the scar on my own side in the mirror, a faded white line that was a map of a betrayal I had never truly healed from. "Dr. Thorne?" the nurse asked, holding out my gloves. "The patient's family is in the waiting room. They're asking for the lead surgeon. They're quite insistent." I pulled on the gloves, the latex snapping against my skin with a sound like a heartbeat. "Let them wait," I said. "I have a heart to fix." I walked into the surgical theater. Silas was on the table, draped in blue, already under anesthesia. He looked old. He looked fragile. He didn't look like the man who called me a martyr. He just looked like a pump that was about to stop. I spent 6 hours inside his chest. I bypassed the damage. I reinforced the walls of his aorta, and I did it with a precision that was almost cold. I didn't feel love. I didn't feel hate. I felt the absolute, unwavering power of my own skill. When the surgery was over, I didn't go home. I didn't send a resident to give the update. I walked through the double doors of the waiting room. Margaret was there, older, her face etched with a decade of worry. Clara was there, dressed in a designer coat, looking impatient. They looked up as I approached, their faces shifting from hope to confusion, and then to a slow, creeping horror as they recognized the woman in the surgical scrubs. "Evelyn," Margaret whispered, her hand going to her mouth, "you're the doctor? We were told the best surgeon in the country was handling him." "I am," I said, my voice resonating in the quiet room, a voice they hadn't heard in 10 years, "and Silas is stable. The repair was successful." Clara stood up, her eyes flashing with that old familiar spite. "Is this why you did it? To trap us here? To make us feel like we owe you again? Did you pull strings to get assigned to this case just so you could play the savior one more time?" I looked at her, at the sister who carried my kidney in her body, a part of me that she had spent a decade pretending didn't exist. I looked at Margaret, who was already looking for a way to turn this into my fault. I didn't flinch. I didn't cry. I simply adjusted my stethoscope and looked at my watch. "No, Clara," I said, my voice devoid of emotion. "I didn't pull any strings. Your father was sent to me because he was dying, and I am the only one capable of stopping it. This isn't about the family. This isn't about attention. This is professional excellence. Silas will be moved to the ICU. You have 10 minutes to see him, and then you will leave. My hospital, my rules." I walked to walk away, but I stopped for one last second.
And Margaret, don't bother with the thank you note. I've already sent the bill to your insurance. I don't need your gratitude. I have my career." The silence behind me was more satisfying than any praise they could have ever given me. I walked back toward the OR, the weight of the past finally falling away, replaced by the steady, rhythmic sound of a heart that was still beating, not because I loved it, but because I was good enough to save it.
The ICU was a cathedral of humming machines and rhythmic beeps, a place where life was measured in digital waves and chemical balances. I stood at the foot of Silas's bed, my tablet in hand, reviewing his post-operative vitals. His heart, the organ I had spent 6 hours stitching back together, was beating with a newfound strength. It was a perfect repair, a masterpiece of surgical intervention. Silas stirred, his eyes fluttering open under the harsh fluorescent lights. He looked disoriented, the remnants of anesthesia clouding his gaze. Then he saw me. He didn't see a daughter. He saw the white coat, the stethoscope, and the cold, unyielding authority in my eyes. "Evelyn?" he croaked, his voice thin and dry. Am I?" "You are alive, Silas," I said, my voice as flat as a heart monitor's baseline. "The aortic dissection has been repaired. Your blood pressure is stabilizing. You'll be under observation for the next 48 hours. He tried to reach out, his hand trembling under the weight of the IV lines. "I saw you in the theater. I thought I was dreaming. I thought I had died and was being judged." "You weren't being judged. You were being operated on," I replied, stepping back to avoid his touch. "There's no room for judgment in my OR, only anatomy." The door to the ICU suite pushed open, and Margaret and Clara rushed in, ignoring the staff-only signs. Clara's face was flushed, her silk scarf fluttering behind her like a battle flag. She didn't look at Silas first. She looked at me, her eyes searching for a weakness, a crack in the armor I had spent a decade forging. "We've been talking to our family lawyer, Evelyn," Clara said, her voice a sharp contrast to the quiet hum of the room. "He finds it highly suspicious that you were the one assigned to this case. A conflict of interest doesn't even begin to cover it. You shouldn't have been allowed near him." I didn't even look up from my tablet. "If I weren't allowed near him, Clara, you would currently be making arrangements with a funeral director. The other 2 surgeons on call refused the case. They said his heart was beyond repair. I was the only one who disagreed." "You just wanted the power," Clara hissed, stepping closer. "You wanted to hold his life in your hands so you could feel superior. It's the kidney all over again. You're addicted to being the one we need. It's pathetic." I finally looked at her. I looked at the slight paleness of her skin, a subtle sign of the organ she still carried, my organ. "I don't need to feel superior, Clara. I am superior in this building," I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "And as for the kidney, I haven't thought about it in years. It was a biological transaction. This surgery, however, was a professional one. Now, if you're going to discuss legalities, do it in the hallway. This is a sterile environment, and your presence is elevating the patient's heart rate." "How dare you speak to your sister that way?" Margaret cried, clutching Silas's hand. "After all we've been through, we lost you for 10 years, and this is how you welcome us back, with coldness and threats?" "You didn't lose me, Margaret. You discarded me," I said, turning to the nurse. "Increase the sedation slightly. He needs rest, not a family reunion." I walked out of the room, the sound of Margaret's protests fading behind the heavy, pressurized doors. I went to my office, a small glass-walled sanctuary overlooking the city. I sat down and looked at my hands. They were steady, perfectly steady. But an hour later, I received a notification on my internal hospital mail. "Urgent peer review inquiry.
From Hospital Ethics Committee, subject, formal compliant, case number 882-THORNE. A formal complaint has been filed by Clara Thorne Hastings regarding unethical conduct and conflict of interest during the emergency surgery of Silas Thorne. The complainant alleges that Dr. Thorne intentionally delayed the surgery to maximize emotional distress and used her position to coerce the family. An emergency hearing is scheduled for tomorrow at 9 a.m. Dr. Thorne's surgical privileges are temporarily suspended pending the preliminary review. I leaned back in my chair, a bitter laugh escaping my throat. Clara hadn't changed. 10 years ago, she used my sacrifice to paint me as a villain. Now she was using my skill to paint me as a criminal. She couldn't live with the fact that I had saved him. She needed to turn my success into a failure, my professionalism into a plot. I pulled up the surgical logs. Every second was recorded. Every incision was justified. I had the video feed from the OR cameras. I had the telemetry data that showed Silas's heart stopping and me bringing it back. They wanted a fight? Fine, but they were forgetting one thing. In a hospital, I wasn't the daughter they could bully. I was the authority they couldn't survive without. I picked up the phone and called my personal lawyer, the one I kept on retainer specifically for the high-risk nature of my work. I said, "Get the files ready, and I want a full medical audit of Clara Thorne Hastings' transplant history. It's time we look at the emotional blackmail they've been talking about for a decade. If they want to play with ethics, we'll play, but they should know I never lose a patient, and I certainly won't lose my career to people who only value a heart when it's stopped." I looked out at the city lights, the white coat feeling heavier than ever. They thought they were dragging me back into their drama. They didn't realize that I was the one holding the scalpel this time, and I was prepared to cut the rot out of this family once and for all.
The boardroom was silent, the air heavy with the smell of old paper and expensive floor wax. 5 members of the ethics committee sat behind a long mahogany table, their faces unreadable. To my left, Clara sat with her lawyer, her chin tilted upward in that familiar pose of practiced victimhood. Margaret sat behind her, clutching a handkerchief as if she were at a wake instead of a professional inquiry. "Dr. Thorne," the chairman began, peering over his spectacles, "the complaint filed by Mrs. Thorne Hastings is grave. She suggests that you manipulated the surgical schedule of your own father to inflict emotional distress, and that your involvement was a violation of the do no harm principle due to your personal history. How do you respond?" I stood up, adjusting the lapels of my white coat. I didn't look at Clara. I looked at the medical board, the only people whose opinions actually mattered to my future. "I respond with data," I said, my voice echoing with surgical precision. "I have provided the committee with the full telemetry logs from the night of Silas Thorne's admission. You will see that he arrived with a 90% aortic tear. The 2 surgeons ahead of me on the roster declined the case due to its unsurvivable nature. I stepped in not for attention, but because I am the only one in this zip code with a 98% success rate on type A dissections." "That's a lie!" Clara shouted, her voice cracking the decorum of the room. "She wanted us to beg. She made us wait in that hallway for hours just to show us she was the boss." "You waited for hours because I was busy stitching your father's heart back together," I countered, finally turning to look at her. "And while we are discussing weights and manipulation, let's look at the records from 10 years ago, the ones your lawyer conveniently forgot to mention." I tapped a key on my laptop, and a decade-old medical file appeared behind the committee. Archived medical record, transplant case number 2016-CT. Patient, Clara Thorne. Donor, Evelyn Thorne. Finding, stage 4 renal failure due to lifestyle-induced toxicity, negligence. Note, donor Evelyn Thorne was pressured by family to bypass standard psychological evaluation. 10 years ago, Clara wasn't just a fragile flower who got sick. She had destroyed her own kidneys through a series of reckless decisions that the family paid to keep out of the headlines. Silas and Margaret didn't want the world to know their golden girl was flawed, so they pressured the youngest daughter, me, to skip the mandatory cooling-off period for donors. They didn't want a hero, they wanted a spare part. Margaret gasped, her face turning a ghostly white. The committee members started whispering, their eyes darting between the screen and the trembling Clara. The narrative that I did this for attention was a cover story. It was a way to make me the villain so they wouldn't have to feel the guilt of what they took from me. They accused me of emotional blackmail to ensure I would never speak the truth about how that kidney was actually obtained. It wasn't a gift of love, it was a harvest of convenience. This is irrelevant to the current case. Clara's lawyer jumped up, his face flushed. It is entirely relevant, the chairman interrupted, his gaze fixed on the screen. Dr. Thorne, do you have documentation of this pressure? I have the emails Silas sent to the clinic's administrator, threatening to pull his corporate donations if the transplant wasn't expedited. And I have the psychological report from the day after the surgery, where I told the therapist I felt erased, a report that was suppressed by my father's legal team. Clara looked like she wanted to disappear into the floor. The victim mask was slipping, revealing the terrified, selfish girl underneath. Margaret began to sob, but this time no one moved to comfort her. I saved Silas Thorne yesterday because I am a doctor, but I saved myself 10 years ago by leaving this family. If this committee finds that my professionalism is a threat because it forces my family to face their own reflection, then I will gladly take my talents to a hospital that values the truth as much as the cure. I walked out of the boardroom before they could even deliberate. I didn't need to hear their verdict. I saw it in their eyes. They didn't see a manipulative daughter anymore. They saw a woman who had been used as a resource and had survived to become an authority. I went back to the ICU. Silas was awake, his breathing assisted by a thin oxygen tube. He looked at me as I entered, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in his eyes. Not fear of death, but fear of me. "You told them," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "I told the truth, Silas." I checked his IV bag. "It's a powerful disinfectant. It stings at first, but it stops the rot." "Evelyn, I was trying to protect the family name." "You were protecting a lie, and you used my body as the foundation for it. But the foundation is gone, Silas. I took it back." I turned to leave, but he called out my name one last time. "Wait, what happens now? What happens to Clara's reputation, to mine?" I paused at the door, the silver cross on my stethoscope gleaming in the light. "The same thing that happens to a heart without a pulse, Silas. It turns cold, and eventually everyone forgets it ever was there." The hospital cafeteria was a vacuum of white noise. The clatter of plastic trays, the low hum of industrial refrigerators, and the distant, rhythmic paging of doctors. It was a neutral ground that felt anything but safe. Clara sat at a corner table, her designer handbag looking like an alien artifact against the chipped formica surface. She looked haggard. The vibrant survivor glow she had cultivated for a decade was fading, replaced by a sallow, grayish tint that only a clinician's eye would truly notice. I walked toward her, my lab coat open, my footsteps echoing with a deliberate, steady pace. I didn't bring coffee. I didn't bring small talk. I brought a manila folder containing the latest lab results from the transplant outpatient clinic, results I had flagged the moment they hit the system. "You look tired, Clara," I said, sitting across from her without waiting for an invitation. "The stress of the ethics hearing didn't suit you, I see." "You ruined everything, Evelyn," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mixture of fury and genuine terror. "The board members, they look at me differently now. The donors for the foundation are asking questions. You dug up a grave that was supposed to stay closed. Was your pride really worth destroying the family's standing?" "My pride? No. My truth, yes," I replied, sliding the folder across the table. "But I didn't ask you here to discuss social standing. I asked you here because your creatinine levels are spiking. Your body is starting to notice that it's carrying a piece of me, and it's decided it doesn't like the company." Clara's hand flew to her side, to the spot where my kidney had lived for 10 years. "What are you talking about? I feel fine. I'm just exhausted from Dad's surgery." "You're not fine. You're in the early stages of chronic rejection," I said, my voice dropping to a clinical, merciless tone. Laboratory report. Renal biopsy overview. Patient, Clara Thorne Hastings. Filtering efficiency, decreased by 22%, last 48 hours. T-cell activity, abnormally high, immune system attacking graft. Diagnosis, acute cellular rejection brought on by prolonged cortisol spike. Stress. Prognosis, without intervention, total system failure within 90 days. Clara stared at the numbers, her eyes darting across the page, as if she could rewrite them with her gaze. "This is a lie. You're doing this to scare me. You're trying to force me to drop the lawsuit, aren't you? You're using my health as a bargaining chip." "I don't need to bargain, Clara. I already won the ethics hearing. The board dismissed your complaint 10 minutes ago," I said, leaning forward. "I'm telling you this as your former donor and your current physician of record. Your body is rejecting the only thing that's keeping you off a dialysis machine. And the irony is, it's rejecting me because you can't stop hating me." "I don't hate you," she snapped, but the lie withered in the air between us. I needed to be the one who mattered, for once. You were always the smart one, the one with the steady hands. I was just the pretty one who got sick. If I admitted you saved me out of love, I'd be in your shadow forever." "So you chose to live in a lie instead of a shadow. But lies are toxic, Clara. They poison the blood. They've finally poisoned the kidney. You need a high-dose steroid treatment and a complete lifestyle overhaul, and you need to stop the legal theatrics before your blood pressure finishes what your ego started." Clara looked at the folder, then at me. For a second, I saw the little girl she used to be, the one who used to cry when she scraped her knee. But that girl was gone, replaced by a woman who had traded her soul for a narrative. "Will you help me?" she asked, her voice small. "Or are you going to let me die just to prove a point?" "I'm a doctor, Clara. I help patients, even the ones who try to take my license. But let's be clear, I am not doing this for attention. I am not doing this for family. I am doing this because I refuse to let my kidney die inside a person who doesn't deserve it. You'll be admitted to the renal ward this evening, under a pseudonym. We don't want to damage the family name with a public health crisis, do we? I turned and walked away, leaving her alone with the cold truth on the table. As I reached the elevator, I felt a strange sense of exhaustion. I had saved my father's heart, and now I was fighting to save my own kidney inside my sister's body. It was a bizarre biological cycle of debt that seemed to never end. I pulled out my phone and saw a message from the ICU. Silas was asking for me, not Dr. Thorne. He was asking for Evelyn. I looked at the silver cross on my stethoscope. I had cut the rot out of the legal case, but the rot in the family was deeper. It was in the marrow. It was in the very organs we shared. I stepped into the elevator, the doors closing on the image of Clara clutching that manila folder like a life preserver. I wasn't the savior anymore. I was the architect of their survival, and the price of that survival was finally being called due.
The renal ward was quieter than the ICU, but the silence here carried a different weight. The heavy, rhythmic thrum of dialysis machines and the sterile scent of failure. Clara lay in the center of the room, her skin now a sickly shade of ivory, her breathing shallow and labored. The high-dose steroids hadn't worked as quickly as we'd hoped. Her immune system, fueled by years of repressed guilt and performative hatred, was locked in a civil war with the kidney I had given her. I stood by her bed, checking the monitors. The numbers were sliding. If we didn't perform an emergency plasmapheresis, a process to scrub her blood of the antibodies attacking the organ, she would be back on the transplant list by morning. And with her medical history, a second match would be a miracle she didn't have time for. The door pushed open, and Margaret walked in. She looked like she had aged 20 years in a week. The expensive pearls around her neck seemed to choke her, and the frantic, polished exterior she had maintained for decades was finally crumbling. She didn't look at the monitors. She looked at me, with a desperate, animal pleading in her eyes. "Evelyn," she whispered, her voice breaking. "The doctors say she's losing it. They say the organ is dying. Please, you are the best. You saved Silas. Save your sister." I didn't turn around. I kept my eyes on the jagged lines of Clara's heart rate. I am trying to save a patient, Margaret, but the patient is fighting the cure. Her body is treating my gift like a toxin. Margaret stepped forward, her hand trembling as she reached for my arm, then pulled back as if she realized she no longer had the right to touch me. "We were wrong. I know that now. Silas told me what you said at the hearing, about the pressure, about the emails. We were so afraid of losing Clara back then that we didn't care who we broke to keep her. We broke you, Evelyn. We took your youth and your health, and then we took your place in this family because we couldn't look at you without seeing our own shame. You didn't just break me, Margaret. You erased me," I said, finally turning to face her. "You let Clara spend 10 years telling the world I was a manipulative martyr. You sat at dinners and listened to her mock the very sacrifice that allowed her to eat that meal. You didn't just stay silent. You nodded in agreement." "I know," Margaret sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "I'll do anything. I'll give you whatever you want. Money, the estate, a public apology. Just don't let her die. Don't let the last thing you gave her be the thing that kills her." I looked at Clara, who was drifting in a semi-conscious haze. "I don't want your money, and I don't want your estate. I've built a life that doesn't require a single cent of Thorne blood. But if I am to step back into this OR, if I am to use my hands to fix the damage your lies have caused, there is a price." Margaret looked up, hope flickering in her tear-stained eyes. "Anything." "A full public retraction," I said, my voice like iron. "A notarized statement sent to every person who was told I blackmailed this family. A press release to the medical journals correcting the narrative of the 2016 transplant.
And most importantly, you will tell Clara when she wakes up that she is not a victim. She is a beneficiary of a love she didn't earn and a sister she didn't deserve. If you hesitate, if you try to protect the name one more time, I walk out of this room and let the natural order take its course." Margaret stared at me, realizing that the reliable daughter was gone forever. I was no longer seeking a seat at their table. I was the one deciding if the table even existed. "I'll do it," she whispered, her voice breaking. "I'll start the drafts tonight. Just please start the procedure." I didn't wait for her to change her mind. I pressed the call button for the surgical team. "Prep room 4 for emergency plasmapheresis and renal arterial bypass. We have a high-risk rejection case. I'll be lead." As they wheeled Clara out, she opened her eyes for a fleeting second. She saw me in my blue scrubs, my mask hanging around my neck, my face a mask of cold, professional determination. She tried to speak, her lips moving without sound. "Save me," she mouthed. "I'm saving the kidney, Clara," I whispered, leaning over her as the gurney began to move. "Try to be worthy of it this time." I spent the next 4 hours in a trance of mechanical precision. I watched her blood cycle through the machine, being stripped of the poisons her mind had created. It was a literal cleansing. I was washing away a decade of resentment, 1 milliliter at a time. My hands never shook, my focus never wavered. When it was over, I stood in the scrub room, the silence of the hospital night wrapping around me. I had done it. I had saved the father's heart and the sister's life within 48 hours. I was the architect of their survival, but as I looked at my reflection in the dark glass of the window, I realized I was still the only one who truly knew the cost of the bricks. Margaret was waiting in the hallway. She held a stack of papers in her hand, the first drafts of the truth. She looked at me, waiting for a sign, a smile, a gesture of reconciliation. I didn't give her one. I simply walked past her, my white coat fluttering like a shroud. "She's stable," I said, without stopping. "The rest is up to her, and the papers had better be on my desk by 8 a.m. I didn't go to the doctor's lounge to sleep. I went to the roof. I stood in the cold wind, looking out at the city where no one knew my name except as a title on a surgical schedule. I was alone, but for the first time in 10 years, the emptiness in my side didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a space I had finally filled with myself. The morning light in the renal ward was cold and unforgiving, stripping away the soft shadows of the night and revealing the harsh reality of the clinical space. Clara was awake. Her vitals were stable, the plasmapheresis having successfully scrubbed the toxic animosity from her bloodstream. But as the physical fog cleared, a much more devastating storm was breaking. On her bedside table lay a copy of the morning's internal hospital bulletin and an open envelope, the one Margaret had delivered to my desk at precisely 8 a.m. It was the public retraction, the notarized truth, the story of a daughter who didn't blackmail, but who bled. I walked into the room, my footsteps silent on the linoleum. Clara was holding the paper, her hands shaking so violently that the edges rattled like dry leaves. Her face, though healthier in color, was twisted in a grimace of pure, agonizing disbelief. You made her do it," Clara whispered, her voice a jagged shard of its former self. "You made Mom tell them, all of them, the board, the donors, the press, they all know. They think I'm a monster now. They think I'm a liar who traded my sister's life for a reputation." "I didn't make her do anything, Clara," I said, leaning against the foot of her bed, my arms crossed over my white coat. "I gave her a choice, her daughter's life or her daughter's lie. She chose life. For the first time in 10 years, someone in this family chose the person over the image." "I have nothing left," Clara screamed, suddenly lunging forward, her hand clawing at the IV line in her arm, as if she wanted to rip the very medicine from her veins. I moved quickly, pinning her wrist to the bed with a strength that surprised both of us. My eyes locked onto hers, cold and unwavering. "Sit down, Clara. You're pulling your stitches. And don't you dare talk about dying. You've spent 10 years living on my time and my flesh. You don't get to throw it away because your ego is bruised." "Why couldn't you just be the quiet one?" she sobbed, collapsing back against the pillows. "Why couldn't you just let us love you in the way we needed to? Why did you have to be so successful, so right?" "Because right is all I had," I said, releasing her wrist. "You took my place at the table, you took my parents' pride, and you took my kidney. All I had left was my skill and the truth. I spent 10 years becoming a surgeon because a surgeon doesn't need a family to tell her she's valuable. A surgeon knows she's valuable because the heart keeps beating under her hands." The door opened and Silas was wheeled in by a nurse. He was still weak, his chest heavily bandaged, but he was alert. He looked at the paper in Clara's hand, then at me. There was no anger in his face now, only a profound, hollow exhaustion. "It's over, Clara," Silas said, his voice a low rasp. "The lawyers called. The news is out. The Thorne name is complicated now. But we are alive, all 3 of us." "Is that enough for you, Silas?" I asked, turning to my father. "Is being alive enough when the legacy you built on my back has finally crumbled?" Silas looked down at his hands, the hands of a man who signed away his daughter's life for a business deal. "No, it's not enough, but it's the only truth we have left. Evelyn, I saw the reports. I saw what you did for her last night. I know I don't deserve to ask, but can we start over, not as thorns, but as people?" I looked at them, the broken patriarch, the shattered golden girl, and the mother who was currently hiding in the hallway, too ashamed to enter. I looked at the heart monitors, the dialysis machines, and the clinical efficiency of my life. "No," I said, the word simple and final. "We can't start over. You don't get to reset a decade of erasure with a single apology. But I will do my job. I will see Clara through her recovery. I will ensure your heart stays strong, Silas. And then I will go back to my life. A life where I am Dr. Thorne, the woman who saved you, not Evelyn, the girl you broke." Clara looked at me, her eyes red and hollow. "You really don't need us at all, do you?" "I haven't needed you since the day I woke up in a recovery room and realized I was alone. Your creatinine levels are improving, the rejection is stabilizing. In 2 weeks you'll be discharged. After that, what you do with the truth is up to you. You can spend the rest of your life trying to rebuild the lie, or you can finally try to be the person you pretended to be." I walked out of the room without looking back. As I moved down the hallway, I passed Margaret, who was leaning against the wall, clutching her pearls. She reached out a hand, but I stepped aside, a professional distance that was wider than any ocean. I went to the rooftop of the hospital. The city was waking up, the sun hitting the glass towers and turning the world into a grid of light. I took a deep breath of the cold, sterile air. I was the surgeon. I was the donor. I was the truth. And for the first time in 10 years, I didn't feel like a part of a family. I felt like a whole person.
The grand ballroom was a sea of silk, champagne, and the low, sophisticated murmur of the city's elite. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen rain from the ceiling, reflecting the light onto the polished black marble floor. Tonight was the National Medical Excellence Awards, and my name was engraved on the primary trophy, the Pioneer in Cardiothoracic Innovation. I stood in front of the full-length mirror in the dressing room, smoothing the fabric of my gown. It was deep emerald green, the color of a forest at twilight, structured and sharp.
It didn't hide the faint line on my side. It honored the woman who carried it. I wasn't wearing the family pearls. I was wearing a simple silver scalpel-shaped pendant, a gift from the residents I had trained. "Dr. Thorne, they are ready for you," the coordinator whispered, knocking softly on the door. I stepped out into the hallway and saw them. They were standing near the entrance to the ballroom, looking like relics of a bypassed era. Silas was in a wheelchair, his face thinner but his eyes clear. Margaret was beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, her posture subdued. And Clara was there, dressed in a simple, modest navy dress. She wasn't the center of attention tonight. She was just a guest, a shadow in the back of the room. They had been invited by the committee, not by me, but as I walked past them toward the stage, the air between us didn't crackle with the old electricity of resentment. It was cold, it was silent, it was professional. "Evelyn," Silas called out softly as I passed. I paused, the train of my dress pooling on the marble. "Mr. Thorne," I said, my voice steady. "You look magnificent," he said, his voice trembling slightly. "We read the journals. We saw the interviews. You've changed the way they look at transplants. You've changed everything." "I didn't change it for you, Silas," I said, looking at him with a calm that was more devastating than anger. "I changed it for the patients who are told they aren't enough. I changed it for the daughters who are treated like inventory." I moved toward the stage as the announcer's voice boomed through the speakers. "And now, for the recipient of the Lifetime Achievement in Surgical Integrity, Dr. Evelyn Thorne." The applause was a tidal wave. I walked up the stairs, the spotlight finding me, blinding and pure. I stood at the podium and looked out at the hundreds of faces. I saw the deans of medical schools, the titans of industry, and in the very back, near the service doors, I saw my family. They weren't at the head table, they weren't on the guest list of the elite. They were watching from the periphery, seeing the daughter they had tried to erase become the sun that everyone else was orbiting. 10 years ago, I was told that my value was defined by what I could give away. I was told that my body was a resource for a greater legacy. But tonight, I stand here to tell you that your value is not in what you lose, but in what you build from the pieces that remain. I looked directly at Clara. She was pale, her hand instinctively touching the place where my kidney lived. She knew that every word I spoke was a brick in the wall I had built between us, a wall of excellence that no lie could ever breach. I dedicate this award to the steady hands, to the people who live in the silence of the truth. Integrity isn't a gift you receive, it's a heart you repair, one stitch at a time. This isn't for the attention, this is for the work. The standing ovation lasted for minutes. As I descended the stage, trophy in hand, I felt a hand on my arm. It was Clara. She didn't have the old fire in her eyes. She looked small. She looked human. "Evelyn, I'm going back to the clinic tomorrow. I'm starting the volunteer program. I'm telling the students the truth, the real truth, not the one Mom wrote, the one you lived." I looked at her, searching for the old manipulation, but I found only a hollow, aching sincerity. "Good, Clara. It's a start. But don't do it for me. Do it because you're tired of being a ghost in your own life." I walked past her, out into the cool night air of the balcony. The city was spread out before me, a grid of possibilities. I didn't wait for Silas to find me. I didn't wait for Margaret to cry on my shoulder. I took a deep breath, the silver pendant cool against my skin. I was the surgeon. I was the pioneer. And as the moon rose over the skyline, I realized that the debt of life had finally been paid in full, not with blood and not with organs, but with the absolute, unyielding power of being whole. The Thorne Center for Regenerative Integrity stood as a monolith of glass and light on the edge of the city's medical district. It wasn't just a hospital, it was a sanctuary for those the system had failed, a place where the ethics of the soul were as important as the precision of the scalpel. I stood in my top-floor office, looking down at the courtyard where a bronze plaque was being unveiled today. It didn't bear the Thorne family crest. It bore a single sentence: "Your life is not a debt, it is a choice." I was no longer the girl who fixed faucets or the surgeon who scrubbed away family sins. I was the director. I was the architect of a new standard. A soft knock came at my door. My assistant, a young woman I had pulled from a struggling residency program, looked at me with a mix of awe and professional respect. "Dr. Thorne, the anonymous donor for the 10 a.m. cross match is here. She signed all the waivers, but she requested to speak with you personally before she goes into prep." "I don't usually meet with anonymous donors, Sarah," I said, my voice steady, though I already knew who was behind that door. "It complicates the protocol." She said she's not doing it for the protocol, she's doing it for the balance. I nodded. "Send her in." Clara walked into the room. She looked different. Shorter hair, no jewelry, and a face that had finally aged into its own truth. The sallow tint of rejection was gone, replaced by the quiet, healthy glow of someone who had spent a year in therapy and even longer in the shadows of real work. She wasn't carrying a designer handbag. She was carrying a medical file. "I'm a match for a 12-year-old boy in the pediatric ward," Clara said, sitting in the chair across from my desk. "Non-directed donation. He's been on the list for 3 years. His parents they're like we were, Evelyn, desperate. But I told them the truth. I told them that a gift given under pressure is a curse. I told them I'm doing it because I can." I looked at her, searching for the old hunger for attention, the need to be the savior she had once pretended to be. I found only a hollow, aching sincerity. "You're risking your health, Clara," I said, my clinical voice taking over. "You've lived with one kidney for a decade. Giving a part of your liver, even a regenerative piece, is a significant burden on your system." "It's not a burden, Evelyn. It's a return," she replied, her eyes meeting mine without flinching. "For 10 years I lived on a part of you that I hated because it reminded me of how much I needed you. I want to live on a part of myself that I finally respect. I'm not doing this for Mom or Silas. I'm not even doing it for you. I'm doing it so that when I look in the mirror, I don't see a thief." I leaned back in my chair, the silver scalpel pendant cool against my skin. "They've been looking for you, you know. Margaret and Silas. They're still trying to rebuild the brand. They want you for the gala next month." "I told them no," Clara said, and for the first time I heard the strength of a woman who had found her own voice. "The Thorne brand died in your OR. I'm living in a small apartment near the clinic now. I'm a social worker, Evelyn. I help people navigate the very system we tried to rig. It's quiet, it's hard, and I've never been happier." I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the city where I had once been a ghost. "Silas's heart is holding up. I checked his last scan. He'll live another 20 years, but he'll spend them in a house that feels like a museum." "He asks about you every day," Clara whispered. "I know, and every day I don't answer," I said, turning back to her. "Professionalism, Clara. I saved his life. That was the transaction. I don't owe him my presence at his dinner table, and he doesn't owe me a place in his will. We are balanced." I walked over to her and placed a hand on her shoulder. It wasn't a hug. It wasn't a reconciliation of sisters. It was the touch of a surgeon acknowledging a successful recovery. "You go into prep in 30 minutes. I'll be the one supervising the harvest, not because you're my sister, but because you're a donor at my center, and I ensure every gift is handled with integrity." "Thank you, Evelyn, for the kidney, for the truth, for the chance to finally be small. Go, Clara. Don't be late for your own life." I watched her leave, her steps light and purposeful. I sat back at my desk and opened the next file, a heart valve replacement, a lung transplant, a world of broken things waiting for a steady hand to make them whole again. The sun set over the Thorn Center, casting long golden shadows across my office. I took the silver cross from my neck and placed it on the desk. I didn't need the symbols of my struggle anymore. I didn't need the scar on my side to remind me of who I was. I was Evelyn Thorn. I was the surgeon who had cut through the lies of a dynasty to find the truth of a human being. I was the donor who had taken her life back. And as the moon rose over the skyline, I realized that the debt of life was no longer a weight around my neck. It was the wind beneath my wings. I picked up the scalpel for the final time that evening, not for a surgery, but to sign a document for a new scholarship, one for students who came from nothing, who had been discarded, who were told they were only worth what they could give away. The story of the Thorn family was over. The story of Evelyn Thorn was just beginning.